So what we're going to talk about today is an industry, like I said, it's centuries old, and it is something that we cannot be without. It is actually defining lots of our, society as we know it, providing, basic steel and metals in general. And it's been metals has certainly been a defining factor for human development over the not only centuries but millennia at this point. And when you think about transformations and when you think about transformative innovation, we all tend to have this rocket fetish, right? It's the artificial intelligence, the digitalization, it is this whole thing. And we also learn that in transformation theory, that the pathways or the path dependencies, the infrastructure, the technology solution, the institutions, the interests, they are the hard ones to break. So setting up something new in artificial intelligence and others would probably so intuitively be much easier than breaking with what is really fixed since centuries. So mining and steel production, metal production, base industries are examples of the things that we thought were really, really difficult. That brings us to two things. First of all, is that really the case? We will hear more about that. Is that really hard to change? And if so, what does it take as compared to others, right? The other thing is that these are really, really important industries to change, right? Because when we're talking about cement, when we're talking about metals, when we're talking about petrol and etc., these are the ones that really need to change drastically. We cannot substitute them from today to tomorrow, and that's so. This is an important field. We are going to do now further down the road, obviously, a similar kind of discussion around the nascent industries. But let's start here, because this is what we have, and this is what has to happen soon. And I'm really glad that you accepted, Elisabeth, to moderate this, because I know, and she will tell us more about it. Elisabeth actually comes from a steel family and grew up in this environment, and having Göran now as her partner of the discussion, I think guarantees or makes for a very interesting conversation. So I'll just step aside and I let the two of you start, and we can move from there. So
super.
Let's go. Yes, let's go from there.
Thank you, Mikael, for this lovely introduction. I'm thinking, as an Austrian, having spent some Christmas in Sweden, because my brother lives in Sweden, I remember these pictures of Santa Lucia, but I actually never had asked for the story.
No.
So what a beautiful story. And it's a story that also, we have many SDGs covered in that story of Santa Lucia. No? So.
No, it represents a lot of interesting things. I didn't mention, but actually the Santa Lucia tradition, if though very different from what we do, obviously with the ginger cookies and the sort of, but Santa Lucia is revered on this day, even in the Philippines. So it's really something that brings kind of the UN setting, right? We live with our differences, and at the same time we work together, right?
So Santa Lucia gives us a great background to discuss, as you said, steel today, mature industries. And maybe just from my side, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, it's always lovely to be with the innovation team. Yeah, it stressed me out a little bit. I can be. But as I said, really excited to be here and thinking about the 18 project. If I remember correctly, it was 2 years ago, just before Christmas, when we drafted the concept proposal, the concept note for the 18. Wow. So it's actually also another reason to celebrate. That was just before vacation, when we kind of first really thought about this. But today, Mikael, as you said, we're going to look at steel, at mature industries. And indeed, I'm very happy to talk about that topic, because I'm from a steel region, and I reflected yesterday evening, and I thought, if I think about my dad, he studied montanistics. So I remember my dad sitting at home and calculating ovens. I think he calculated how the heat goes in the blast furnaces or something. I have no clue, yeah. But I also remembered that I went as a kid to kindergarten in Austria, And I went to the so-called Werkskindergarten, so the Germans will understand, no? Which was the kindergarten in the factory, because we all went there, given that my dad worked for the company, yeah? And so I had seen, on the one hand, I had benefited from, all the infrastructure that was put in place by a then not even social democratic, but socialist government in Austria for the steel kind of like environment. But obviously, as I grew a little bit older, I also could see how the whole region went down. So for me, this idea that the steel industry is an essential industry, is an interesting industry, but it's also one that underwent transition. I think in our region, and that's the so-called Murmürzfurche in Austria, we have really sort of like experienced this. So I'm super happy to be here, and it's also timely because COP just concluded. Apparently they did conclude, yeah? So there is some sort of language which will surely generate a lot of discussion about what will happen to CO2 emissions, but we also know that the steel industry will have a role to play in all of this. So with that, having talked about myself, let's talk about Göran. Yeah, Göran Nyström, our guest, a Swede. I hope you feel a little bit at home here, because I understand you are on the other side of the planet in Australia right now, no? Judging from the light that comes through your ceiling, you're not in the northern hemisphere, particularly not far out.
Yeah, no, that's a lamp actually, so it's quite late here, but yes, I am in Australia at the moment.
Okay, good. Well, happy to have you. And I kind of like, we've already had a really interesting discussion some month ago. And I understand, Göran, you have different functions all related to the steel industry. Yeah, so you have been with Ovako, which is really one of the leading companies in that field. And if I understand correctly, you were executive vice president for marketing and technology. So also like, I guess, on the communication side, and you're still with them. No, you're still sort of like engaged in advising the CEO of that company. But you also have different other roles, like, for example, your role with FerroSilva. Let's see whether we can get you back. We lost you on our screen. But FerroSilva, there you seem to be a partner, if you're still with us. Exactly.
I'm here. And I hope it works. Yes.
Now we have you back. Exactly. Super. And then you also worked for Sandvik. No? So Sandvik is more really on the mining side. And kind of cool, because Ovako seems to be sort of like the larger company, yeah. FerroSilva is the small startup, cutting edge, but I think also Ovako has produced some really interesting things, and Sandvik obviously also very, very related. So I'm sure you can tell us a whole lot of things of how this steel industry, this mature industry, as we referred to it here today, how it has changed. And I thought I'd try to think a little bit about the different issues to discuss in this transformative innovation podcast. And maybe one of the first ones, Göran, if you can just tell us a little bit, maybe give us a quick intro into how the steel industry, and particularly Ovako, let's talk about the Swedish steel industry for a moment, how you have been, or this have been leading the way in terms of like also decarbonizing steel production. That's really something like on top of the news today here as we got out of COP. What is happening in Sweden in this regard?
Well, there's a lot of things happening. Thank you, Elisabeth, and it's a pleasure to be here. I will tell you what I know and the sort of general trends that we can see. Of course, steel is one of the largest man-made emission sources of carbon dioxide. So for that reason, it needs to change. So we are all aware of that situation, but of course, when you start to study the situation more closely, it becomes more and more complicated to understand all the different trends going on. And before we talk about steel, you always need to talk about iron. So the iron making is, of course, the biggest source of emissions. And like other metals that we find, iron is tied to oxygen. So the whole story of steel making starts with energy, the energy that is needed to transform an oxide into a metal, to go from iron oxide to metallic iron. And that is the big challenge that we are struggling with. So beyond that, of course, the whole steel making process and the making of steel products accounts for large emissions as well. And since many other industries are dependent on steel in their products, it becomes linked in a value chain where quite often the big emitting factor in another product is the steel that is chosen. So I don't know how far I should go right now, but the big thing is about finding another energy source to reduce oxide into metallic iron, and to also substitute fossil energy sources in the continued steel making process. And that's where we are, Ovako, we are a leader in the world today, but we still want to chase ahead to ensure lowest possible emissions. And we are also interestingly a subsidiary of Nippon Steel Corporation, one of the large steel companies in the world. So we are also a little bit of an experimental arm for them, I should say. So I think we are watched quite closely in Japan with regards to what we do.
Super interesting. So Göran, if we maybe stay with the technological side for one more moment, because I mean, also for me as a non-innovation person, you know, the first thing with innovation, you think technology. Yeah, I know it's much more, but if we stay with technology a little bit, can you tell us, is there one or there are maybe like different ways how one can make steel greener? And I'm just thinking in the Austrian news, it was quite prominent the other day that First Alpine, yeah, so that's the sort of like key company in Austria, they are just replacing or decided to replace 2 of their blast furnaces with these sort of like electric arc furnaces. Yeah, so both in Linz and in Donawitz, they plan by 2027 onwards replace these furnaces. Now, is there kind of one mainstream technology to make steel green, or is there maybe different technological solutions and different pathways being pursued?
Indeed, and the electric arc furnace plays a central role. That is, of course, nothing new. It's been for a long time a method of making steel, but not of making iron. It's the steel making part of the process where that comes into play. And metallic iron, of course, exists also as scrap on the planet. And with all the steel constructions that are put into use, the recycling of scrap is a very important aspect of steel making. Today, roughly 28%, something like that, of steel making in the world is scrap based. And therefore you already have the metallic iron, not the iron oxide. And then you can just simply melt it in an electric arc furnace. So it's not so that we can simply implement electric arc furnaces and everything is solved, because we don't have enough scrap. So the issue now is, how do we generate the right balance between using as much scrap as ever possible and reducing iron oxide to iron in a form that can be used in electric arc furnaces. And therefore, instead of the so-called integrated steel making, which has been the leading way of making steel, still is, with the so-called blast furnaces, instead of that integrated iron and steel production together, now we see more and more that people are looking at ways to produce so-called direct reduced iron, DRI. Direct reduced iron is then a component that you can melt in turn in an electric arc furnace. So what you mentioned, the trend you have seen and what you have heard, also means that that factory itself is going to be dependent in the future on a supply of DRI. And if you take Europe, for instance, there is no DRI production in Europe at the moment. There is, however, in the world, 10% of the steel or the iron production in the world comes through the DRI route. And DRI is typically produced in countries where you have cheap natural gas. So the natural gas making of steel, that route is already in existence, and it emits less carbon dioxide than the blast furnace route. But it's only 10% of the iron production in the world. And of course, people are not looking to convert to a new natural gas dependency, but instead trying to find a completely fossil-free way of making DRI.
And do you think that this complete fossil fuel-free way will be available at some point?
Absolutely, this is clear, and the main sort of discussion has been how to use hydrogen. And hydrogen, as you know, can be produced from water with enough amounts of electricity. So the requirement for electricity, again, from fossil-free sources, otherwise it doesn't make sense. If you have abundant supply of electricity from fossil-free sources, you could produce hydrogen from water at a cost, that's not maybe the most energy efficient way, but certainly it's a very efficient way to remove carbon dioxide. And if you have hydrogen in the iron making, when you reduce iron oxide to iron, then of course hydrogen combines with the oxide and generates water. So this is a process that exists only today at rather small early stage levels. It has a couple of problems. One is, of course, the water that is generated in the process, and the other is that it's actually an endothermic process. It requires heat to keep it stable. But that is a main development area for Sweden. In Sweden, we have SSAB together with Vattenfall and LKAB. So the mining company, the electricity company, and the steel company, they are working together in a so-called hybrid project. And at the same time, we have this newcomer called H2 Green Steel, starting from scratch and pursuing this method of making metallic iron. And many others in Europe are now looking at it, yes.
You've given me a lot of kind of like directions for later parts of the conversation, like the idea that this scrap, we work a lot on circularity in UNECE, so you're basically reusing something. I see sort of like a circular value chain here, yeah? But you also mentioned that it's important to think if we go for a new technology that we are not putting ourselves into new dependencies. No? So if we are dependent now, maybe earlier on one was dependent on where to mine the ores you needed. And I think that's the case in my home area, that there was this so-called Erzberg just around the corner, and everybody knew where the mining would take place, and then you had the plant next to it. No? While in today's world, we ship things around the globe, but still we might be totally dependent. Or also when we think about the new energy sources, it depends now on whether you have a lot of light, for example, or heat and a lot of sun. So that's also quite interesting. But maybe before we wrap up that part, knowing that or hearing that there are different new technological solutions being explored, particularly in Sweden, you mentioned that the hydrogen option, yeah. Why do you think, what drove that change? Was there anything particular in the Swedish context that made these companies, be it Vattenfall, and to work together to come up with these new solutions?
If I take a little historic outlook here, I mean, in the 1700s or so, little Sweden accounted for, I think, half of the steel that was traded in the world came from Swedish origins, because thankfully we had very high quality ore. And in those days, the steel making, the energy source used was forests. And then in the 1800s, it was instead hard coal. So mined coal, fossil coal that has been used. That meant that steel making was put in other places in Europe to a much larger extent. And Sweden it was marginalized in terms of volume as a steel maker, but all the steel companies in Sweden specialized and started to do niche steel of the highest quality. With a long tradition, we've always been exploring innovative new ways of making steel. And the only blast furnace producer in Sweden today is SSAB. All the others, we have electric arc furnaces. But SSAB, of course, was under tremendous pressure to change. They account for some 10% of the CO2 emissions in Sweden. So that one company has really a pivotal role to make Sweden go greener. So I would say they were driven very much out of necessity. The pressure to make a change has been very large. And of course, as you know, there are these traded emission rights, which are forecasted to go up and up in price. So I would say a large portion of what's happening has been driven out of the need and demand to do something, but also very importantly is of course the opportunities that many companies see. And the opportunities are so large that even then in Sweden we have this new startup, H2 Green Steel, starting from absolutely zero, but seeing that the opportunities in establishing this new way of making steel are so large that it's worth investing a lot of money in doing so. So both the sort of need-driven, but also an opportunity-driven way of looking at this.
And combined with a country or where innovation and finding new solutions was always hard. Is that like that has happened already centuries ago that the region or the industry had to adjust. Now, Göran, you mentioned something very interesting. You flagged again that this H2 Green Steel is sort of like a startup, yeah, or a small company. And I understand you are engaged in Ovako, but you're also engaged in what is a startup like the FerroSilva company. Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about this combination and maybe the synergies that come from the established companies and the startups, or are these two different ecosystems, or how does this interplay?
Right. Now, this is very interesting. The steel making is closely tied then to the energy that we use. And energy, if you look at Sweden today, total energy use, not electricity, is 10% roughly is nuclear. 20% of the energy in Sweden is hydro and wind and solar, let's say the circular energy forms. 30% of the energy used in Sweden is fossil products, oil and all the derivatives. And then you have 40% of all energy in Sweden today is actually bioenergy. So it's easy to forget that and take it for granted, so to say, but we have, for both the historical reasons, the bioenergy was what drove steelmaking, and again, bioenergy could be a part of the solution for the future. And we all know how flammable bio products are. We know when they decompose, how they generate heat. And that's very much the situation today, that a lot of the biomass that we are not using, all the residue, we are just leaving it to decompose. And a large portion of that is just going into the atmosphere, generating carbon dioxide or methane as it decomposes. So the idea behind FerroSilva is to use biomass again for steel making, but in a much smarter way. And this time to use the residue from agricultural and from forest activities. So this basic concept is to use 3 known technologies and combine them in a way that has never been combined before. One is the gasification of biomass products. And after you've gasified it, you scrub out, that's the second step, to scrub out the carbon dioxide in that making of what is called a syngas. So the reactive syngas that you generate after scrubbing the carbon dioxide is 50% hydrogen, but also 50% carbon monoxide. And that's actually the perfect mix, which is what is used in natural gas countries to produce DRI. You have then 50% an endothermic reaction and 50% an exothermic reaction, and you can control the energy levels in a good way. And that leads you to the third step, which is this reduction shaft furnace, which is used to produce DRI. So you have here 3 technologies, one that is typically used in pulp and paper, one that is used in refinery operations, and one that is used in natural gas countries for DRI production. Combining them together means that you can reuse the heat and the energy between the processes. And using residue from biomass means that you can capture the carbon dioxide instead of it being released into the atmosphere. So if I'm a little bit bold, if I am a visionary, I can say that we can, yeah, we can actually, if this process works as well as we think it will, we can take the largest man-made source of CO2 emissions and turn it around to become the largest carbon sink in the world. So instead of allowing it to release, let's say 2 tons per ton of iron or steel, CO2, we could actually capture close to 1 ton of CO2 in this process. So that's a huge change if we manage. So I think that is really interesting because, as I said, if you just look at hydrogen from water as your only method of making this, then you need large amounts of electricity, you need a power grid, you need a lot of things that many parts of the world not easily can implement. But if we talk about biomass and residue from agriculture and from forestry, then obviously the whole world has access to an energy source that rather quickly then, and if we develop this technology, then rather quickly, instead of building all those large electricity generations, this could become a method of iron making. So that's what really that's really why I'm sort of putting a lot of my time on this project.
And you know, here on the screen we can actually see you smile when you talk about that part. That came totally across. So I guess what is for our transformative innovation discussion here, if there is one thing I remember you kept emphasizing in the team, is that transformative innovation is a lot about combining things in a new way. And I think here, Göran, you just gave us a beautiful example. You said all these different technologies have been around independently, but the great idea is really to combine them, and then you can create something that potentially, as you said, is super transformative. Yeah, because we can turn something that is the biggest problem now into being a key solution on it. So it's almost turning it upside down. So this is beautiful. Now, is this
and may I say that also from the captured carbon dioxide, that is now seems to become a very valuable product. So from just being something that we consider as, store it, hide it away, people are now seeing the opportunity to take biogenic carbon dioxide, combine it with hydrogen and build biomethanol. So when you look at the sea freights around the world, this could actually be the product that could actually help to substitute diesel. So that's another aspect of this. So we're really combining value streams. You're absolutely correct.
So you brought me to the next point, because it seems that there is then maybe new industries or new sort of like, it will have spillovers, as you mentioned, on transport, on other sectors as well, I guess, no?
Yeah, yes.
And Göran, is this something sort of like, what's the time scale for this? Is this something, are we talking 10 years? Are we talking 50 years? Or I have no clue. Like, tell us a little bit. How concrete or how soon do you expect something like this to happen in initial stages? Or is it already happening at a very small stage in the FerroSilva company and its surroundings?
Yeah. First, a comment on spillovers. I think it's such an important concept that, another word for it is synergy, right? So another word for synergy is efficiency. So it's all about capturing as efficiently as possible the energy sources we have at hand and use that between industries. We have another live example in Ovako in Hofors in Sweden, which is actually the largest fossil-free hydrogen production in Europe today, which is just recently opened, which is helping us to substitute fuels for the steel heating. After the steel making, we also heat the steel before hot rolling. In that case, we see large synergies with regards to the society around us. We use the heat. We use the ability to turn on and turn off the electrolyzer to stabilize the grid. And we can also produce hydrogen for the transport industry. So we have a tremendous partnership there between different types of companies. And the same thing with FerroSilva. It's actually a very compact, unique way of combining those interests and generating only useful byproducts in the process. So what we need to do now is to build the first demonstration plant, and based on that, convince others to move in this direction, to replicate that plant around the world. And the first plant is planned also to be in Hofors in Sweden at the Ovako site. And we are seeking the financing needed for this, where the Swedish Energy Agency plays a very important role. And with that, we will also have some equity sold to different actors that will be interested. And we have already, since a couple of years, the work has been going on. So there's a very large pre-study produced, which was supported by Sweden's largest agriculture company, Lantmännen, and also not only Sweden's, but Europe's largest forest owner, Sveaskog, has been supporting it, together with 3 leading steel companies in Sweden, us, Ovako, the previous Sandvik, now Aleima, and also Uddeholm that belongs to the Böhler Group. They have all been supporting this pre-study.
Now
then you can ask yourself.
Sorry, because Böhler was the company in Kappenberg. So Böhler, who then became Böhler,
there you go.
That's what my dad worked for. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, that's, you mentioned sort of like you are in the process of also finding the financing for this and combining the different actors to go forward jointly, no?
Yes, very much so. So if we are successful, it could be in place in 2027 is the plan. And then, depending on the interest to scale it up, because we will build a roughly size 1 to 10. If we want to scale it up to full size, we need the proof of concept and then more money, but it could follow a couple of years after. And then we have the blueprint in place for what could happen in the rest of the world also.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So 2027 is actually quite soon, and definitely before the 2030 target for the SDGs. I see you are maybe watching the time, but let me ask 2 or 3 more questions.
Yes.
I wanted to say, you talked so nicely about the synergies, yeah, and I see there on the one hand on the input side, so what is going into the new green steel making process, and here I would love us to say, or maybe spend a moment on discussing circularity, yeah, because I see this really as sort of the scrap steel going into, but then also on the output side. So there is on the one hand the fact that all those industries that use greener steel will all become greener, no? So our windmills will become greener, the sort of like, to the extent that the automotive or the cars or the rail tracks are using steel, it will be better with green steel. But then you mentioned something very systemic, the stabilization of the grid. I have not thought about that, but that's almost like, I don't know, that's almost sort of a contribution to the public good that the grid becomes more stable, yeah? So to what extent is the circularity discussion in one way or the other figuring in these policy debates that you are joining?
Right. I mean, this is such an important topic that you bring up. And I think, first of all, this value chain from end consumers to the source of CO2 emissions is extremely important. That what we refer often to cradle to gate, that we take responsibility for everything we buy. And that's really how we should see it, all of us. And certainly industrial purchasers today have taken far too little responsibility for what they buy. There's been far too little concern or pressure on what they actually buy. So we are, as always, voting with our wallets. So we need to make that part of the reality for industrial purchasing as well. But indeed, with that, we can create the pressure for more green products and green value chains. But circularity it goes hand in hand with green. It's not only about low CO2, it's about reusing resources, which is the most energy efficient way that we can manage our societies. And therefore, we need to take good care of all the byproducts and all the waste that is generated at the end of life. And that again brings me back to the circularity of steel. Steel is a beautiful product that it can be recycled over and over again. It doesn't lose its properties, except for one thing. And that one thing is copper. There's so much copper in the world that is used that when this is mixed together in the scrap handling or in products very often closely together, then it ends up in steel, and over time the copper content is rising ever so slowly, but it's already in fact a concern for some of our steel products. And over time, this will, if we don't, if we're not careful about this, it will be contaminating the steel that we use. So green steel today is already a reality, but then it's based on circular products, on the scrap. And when we talk now today about green steel making, it's actually the green iron, to reduce iron oxide into iron. So the language is confusing here. And the reason we are so green in Ovako is because we are 100% of our iron atoms, they come from scrap. We don't use anything from mining, nothing.
Which is really interesting if you think about that. Originally, having access to the mine was the key location of determinant for where the plant is, and now with scrap, this is much less so. I would have masses of further questions, but I understand that also Enrique has a question, no? And great, Enrique, to have you here. I see you in the Angstadt office, so let me hand over to you for your question or comment.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Göran and colleagues for organizing this. I'm learning myself, actually very timely. I want to learn more about ammonia in shipping and how to make green steel. So this is one of the ticks. Liz mentioned before the innovation happens in the technological sense, but also in the sort of a social organizational sense. On the technological sense, I mean, you mentioned, Göran, and thank you, the biomass pathway, the syngas, which for those of us who lived in Sweden and had touch contact with the pulp and paper industry, is a very common narrative / environment or technical environment around in the Nordic countries. I wonder if there is any technology for steel making, perhaps in the southern hemisphere, that involves directly solar energy utilization with concentrators and so on, or if this technology never achieves the level of energy necessary to process those metals. That's my technical question, or whether in the southern hemisphere solar could be a thing. And finally, the more kind of a social organizational question is hydrogen, electric arc. Those things might be more expensive than using coke, like the coal to process those materials. So you might get green steel that is more expensive than conventional steel. Who buys it? Who buys green steel? So where is the source of demand? Does regulation have to force it for markets to use it, like say fence it within the EU, fence it within Sweden, or is there some kind of market learning curve that actually the cost gets reduced? I had also minor question whether companies have like a green line for internal markets and a dirtier line for export markets, but that's sort of an add-on question. If you can comment, that'd be great. Thank you.
Enrique, all very good. We had technological question, yeah. We had the policy question, yeah. We had the business case question. Göran, handing over to you that you answer them in combination of the three of them, I guess, yeah?
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's such a huge topic. I'm going to try to keep my answer brief, so allow for more questions also. But first of all, solar energy, obviously, out of the energies I talked about, the 40%, 30, 20, 10 in Sweden, it's only the nuclear energy, uranium really, that has another origin, and the rest is solar energy. So it's a primary source of all our energy on the planet, more or less. So, I mean, the more we can go to directly capture solar energy, the better it is, obviously. And if you have abundance of cheap electricity, you can also then turn water into hydrogen and oxygen and use the hydrogen from such a method. So that is indeed an opportunity I see in the future, which may, in fact, what I'm saying then is that perhaps the hybrid kind of process, that iron making, could perhaps be even better applied in countries with a lot of solar energy. But there are many obstacles on the way there, so I think we are in a much higher urgency today to act than just wait for that. Biomass certainly exists in when we look at the availability of biomass, and especially when we look at it together with where the iron ore is available, we have so many places in the world. So that is actually not a restriction. I see that as a good opportunity still. Yes, the steel making using today the electricity from fossil-free sources and then creating the hydrogen and making the steel, so on, learning all these methods, that is a more costly way. The blast furnaces have been optimized through centuries, and they are a very cost-efficient way of producing large-scale commodity steel products. The reason why we have been using electric arc furnaces in Ovako and other steel companies in Sweden is because it has been very good for flexibility, for smaller volumes, and when you want to generate many different types of steel grades. For those purposes, that extra cost has not been so important. But if you take the large-scale commodity steel products, there will be an additional cost factor. But this is, of course, where the emission costs, the trading rights, the ETS system is putting a lot of burden in the future onto that kind of steel making. So there could well be a situation in not such a far distant future where the cost is neutral between the two options. Having said that, there is something we must not forget, that is, in the Middle East or other places of cheap natural gas, where the DRI is produced today that I mentioned, all of them have the opportunity to actually implement carbon capture onto those processes. It's much easier than doing it for a blast furnace. So that is something I think we will see once the demand is there from customers. We will see also in those countries that they add the carbon capture, and that may well be a much more cost-efficient way of doing it. So there are competing technologies here, and the cost structures are really important to consider. So a great question. I could talk for a long time about this one.
So, but I fear we only have 10 minutes left. Before I hand back over to the team here, let me see whether there is another question from the floor, and then I would have one more. But this is Stephanie. No, exactly, Stephanie. Yep, your hand is up. Over to you.
Hello, thank you. Stephanie Engelhardt. We are developing zero-emission and autonomous boats, and I have a technical question because our partner is, you told us that the Swedish are focused on special steel, not the normal steel. I think this is China, the biggest producer, and our partner is working with super duplex. And is there a difference between the different steels and the greenhouse gas emissions, or is it all the same?
Fantastic question, Stephanie. And you should know that actually at one point I was the leading expert in the world on super duplex. So I was a pioneer. Yeah, so super duplex is my baby. I was head of the development of super duplex. I was head of the market introduction. So I could talk for hours about super duplex also if you want.
Okay. I think we should make a meeting afterwards.
With dinner, you know,
But no, I mean, I think the thing is that's a stainless steel. It contains high amounts of alloys. And again, we go back to this cradle to gate approach. The large emitting source for making such steel is production of the nickel that is needed, for instance. So it's all going back to all the sources going into the steel is really important. That adds emissions, it adds costs, and so on. Beyond that, super duplex, which is a specialty of Sandvik then, or Aleima today, It's an electric arc furnace process, similar to all the other special steels there. And it's just, you have to look at alloying content, but thankfully super duplex is reasonably low in alloy compared to some of the alternatives in the market.
Good. You know, it's really nice to see Göran smile when he talks about something that is totally exciting. It's also really nice to see Jakob with us. You know, as always, Jakob fully professional with his tie, while we are sort of relaxed.
It's Jakob Lindvall.
It's Jakob. We have two Jakobs here. Yes. Wonderful. You see, exactly. I didn't. Great. So over to the Swedish Jakob, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, and I'm will be quite short. My name is Jakob Lindvall. I'm working as a senior advisor, very much within the innovation ecosystem, of course, in Sweden and Europe. And my question is, the original idea to FerroSilva, where is the knowledge developed that transform into a business, and what's your plan for scaling all over the world?
Thank you. So yeah, there were two inventors in Sweden with a long history in steel making, and they have the insights needed to see that maybe there would be an option, instead of using hydrogen directly from water and electrolysis, that could be another option. They realized that the cost aspects, CO2 aspects and so on would make this perhaps a more viable solution. So they turned to the Swedish Energy Agency with the support from some of the companies that I mentioned, including Ovako and myself, and asked for money for a pre-study. But they had been turned down a number of times, but in the end they got the money for the pre-study. And that was done then with resources at KTH and at Chalmers. And I think also there's a famous gasification project in Sweden called Gobi Gas, and some of the people behind there, they were also instrumental on the west coast in Sweden. But Chalmers and KTH, then Gothenburg and Stockholm, the real top experts there have been involved. And we have also later contacted experts in Lund in the south of Sweden, which have another strong tradition in looking at carbon capture. So we're trying to use the best university resources, but together with people that come from the industry. And I joined these other two inventors then a year or a year and a half ago.
Great. Thank you for that answer, and thank you to all colleagues and participants who posed some questions. Team is telling me we have to wrap it up. Yeah.
Yes.
There would be millions of other interesting things to discuss, including, you know, the role of the government, the role of policy, the role of the UN. I think we have to do a steel dinner at some point. The great steel dinner. Okay. But with that, I hand over to you, and Göran, many thanks. I look forward to continuing that exchange. Yeah.
Yes. No, I think, thank you so much. Again, I don't think we should even try doing wrap-ups. Just saying that I think this, if anything, go back to where I started. I mean, this is the essence of transformative innovation in my world. You said combined technologies means combining industries, making synergies, and not only between industries. I think one of the important points here was actually what you told us about connecting with society itself. You know, the feeding into the electricity system and guaranteeing, sort of goes back to the whole idea of what steel industry was back in the old days, so to speak. We will have obviously another one, a similar discussion on nascent industries, nascent technologies moving down the road. But I say just thank you. I think this was fantastic. Now, I have known Göran for many years. I think we have some 30 years of friendship soon, or even 40s. I mean, we're getting old. So, but I you know, you have no idea what lurks behind this serious face. And so we actually gonna follow up on what we have had as a little bit of a finalizing moment of our seminar so far. We have then the voting of, there are 3 statements here that he has written for us about himself. I have 4 children, 2 pairs of twins, as one of them. I've been the lead singer in front of a symphony orchestra. And then I used to be a professional windsurfer in Australia. Yeah, think about that one, where he is. So one of them is correct. The other ones are then, invented examples. So let's vote and see what it is. What do you think out there? There is a voting procedure. It's ongoing. So let's see where we land, and then he can explain himself, disclose a little bit of how we're going there.
So 60% still going. 66% are for the first statement.
Oh, okay. So you have supposedly 4 children on 2 pair of twins. How do you relate to that, Göran?
Yeah, statistically it's possible, of course, but no, I have 3 children, one of each, as you should say these days.
Yes.
No, but no, I'm a happy father of a son, daughter, and son, but not 4 children. No, not yet.
And none of them twins.
Yeah, none of them twins. No.
What is the truth here? What's the correct answer?
3 children. 3 children. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about the options that you gave us.
Oh,
the 3 alternatives.
Well, okay. Yeah, right. Well, I am in Australia together with my life partner. She used to be a professional windsurfer in Australia, so I put that in for that matter.
Okay. Wow.
But myself, I have been a lead singer in front of a symphony orchestra, so I've been toying around with music, and we arranged some music of actually the founder of Pink Floyd, Syd Barrett. And when his hometown Cambridge celebrated Syd Barrett with an art installation, they invited us over, and I booked myself the whole symphony orchestra on airplane tickets to go over there and perform a big thing in front of 1,200 people or so. So that was quite the experience.
I tell you, you should don't hesitate to do some self-promotion. I have been following you. What's the name of your band?
It's we are called Men on the Border for a reason that is hidden in his lyrics. So Men on the Border.
Okay, yeah. Men on the Border. Check it out on Spotify, and you can see a very different Göran with an even bigger smile. Trust me. This man. Yeah. With that said, thank you so much for a very, very interesting podcast, at least from my point of view, for a very interesting conversation. Thank you, Elisabeth, for excellent moderation, and thank you, Göran, for taking your time on the other side of the planet. We hope to see you here. You were here about a year ago, and Courmayeur and Latuille is still waiting for you. He's an avid skier also for very good. So let's work on this. There's certainly many openings for continued conversation, and you and Stephanie should have a separate one. I realize that. So with that said, have a good one. Happy holidays. We will be back. We are now defining the next podcast, but we will take on from mid January. We're just finalizing the exact program, but we will be back to all of you. And so have a very good holidays.
Thank you all, and very insightful and great questions. So lots of room for more discussions and more, let's say, spillover effects. So thank you.
Good synergy. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.